Hey there, Point Church. For those who don't know me, I'm Joey. I'm the worship leader here, and for those who don't know Sam, he's the pastor here. If you don't know us, that's on you, honestly. I mean, we're here every morning. But that being said, we're doing something a little bit different as we, just kind of decompress from the season of Advent and Christmas and everything like that. And so as you're enjoying this in your cozy pajamas at home, we're going to be asking some questions and answering some questions that aren't often talked about. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy this today. So Sam,
Yep.
we have some interesting questions, some lobby talk, some, coffee banter, whatever you may want to call it.
Yeah, the conversations that kind of get asked on the way out of church, or like when you're standing around the parking lot, you're like, I've always wondered, what about this? What about that? Yeah.
Right. Right. So we're gonna dive into it and just go headstrong. Science versus God.
Yeah.
Who wins, and can they coincide with each other? And is it possible to be a Christian and still, can you believe in science? I mean, how does that balance out?
Yeah, this is the question that I remember getting asked a lot as a youth pastor. Like, you'd have a student who was in a biology class, chemistry, physics class, and they're getting really into it, and they have a gift for this, and they're like, wait, am I allowed to go into this? Does science disprove the existence of God? Like, how do we, pair these things together? And the short answer is they absolutely go hand in hand together in so many ways, because they're answering different questions in many ways. Like, science is the study of the natural created world. Like, you're trying to understand the different elements of creation. And so often that is what we are called to do as Christians. So if you were to go back and examine the history of the field, the study of science, it is impossible to remove the Christian influence over scientific history. In fact, it was the early Christians who really formed the study of science because they saw it as an extension of their worship, to understand God's created order. And so they took the command very seriously in, the early centuries of the church of love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. That the two are, you're not meant to check your mind at the door when you come into church and be like, oh, and I just don't think rationally, I don't think in terms of facts. Right. But it's like, no, they saw it as like, to understand God, let's study his created universe. So I took the liberty of, we stacked the deck. I knew what the questions were ahead of time. But I took the liberty of just looking up a few examples of, the Christian influence on scientific study over the centuries. So you have Pope Gregory the 13th. He was the one who said, we need to come up with a universal calendar to understand the year. So it was the Pope working through the monks in the monastery that came up with our Gregorian calendar of 365 and a quarter days to understand, the calendar that we have. You have a French chemist who was actually a Catholic who was considered the father of modern chemistry. His last name was Lavoisier. I think I'm saying that right. Antoine Lavoisier, 17th century philosopher, is considered the father of chemistry. Devout Catholic. You have Isaac Newton, again, very strong Christian, discovers the law of gravity. You have Blaise Pascal, the Pascal, method. He had all these mathematical equations when it comes to triangles, different things like that. He also was considered a modern, theologian of his time. And he would go and argue in the universities and the seminaries about the existence of God. His famous argument was, it is better to live as if there is a God and find out at the end there's not. You'll have a better life that way than to live as if there is no God, only to get to the end of your life and discover there is a God. So it's called Pascal's wager. So they used logic and reason to not only discover the known universe, but also to understand, God. So for 2,000 years, Christianity walked hand in hand with science. And I think it's silly, in my opinion, when we try and pit the two against each other, because one helps to prove the other, because they're really answering different questions. Science is seeking to understand God's creation, and the other, theology is trying to help us understand who is the creator, and like what are, ethics in the world today. How are we to understand how we should approach the world? So they're answering different questions, but yes, you can absolutely believe in both, and I believe you should.
Well, I'm just curious. I mean, why do we think there's been that divide between, you know,
Yeah.
why is it that mindset of they can't coincide?
Well, it's become one of those pseudo culture war isn't quite the right word, but it's the one that comes to mind, where it's like, well, to be a devout Christian, you have to believe that everything happened exactly as it said in Genesis, that exact way, whereas the book of Genesis is, especially Genesis 1 and 2, is written in a format of ancient Hebrew poetry. And like all good poetry, it's speaking on different levels. So I heard a theologian once say that the purpose of Genesis and the creation story that is laid out in the Bible is not trying to have the reader understand when and how the universe was created. It doesn't seem interested in answering that question. What Genesis seems to be really teaching us is who created the universe and why.
Right.
Who is this God and why did he create the universe? That's what Genesis seems to be more interested in interesting. So,
Well, speaking of creation, obviously this topic gets a lot of questions, and just I feel like this also relates to it. So let's talk about the dinosaurs. Were they in the Bible, and what are we to think of them? I mean,
Yep.
you think of Jurassic Park, right?
Right,
And then
right.
you think of like the Garden of Eden, and it's like, I don't know, was there a T-Rex there? You know
yeah,
what I mean?
right. Yeah, a few things come to mind when you think about the dinosaurs or macro, micro evolution versus 6 days creation. Probably the most important thing for us to understand is you have a pyramid, a level of beliefs that are of the most important to the least important when it comes to theology. Most important is Jesus is the Christ, physical resurrection, virgin birth. Like if you don't affirm those, you are not a Christian.
Right.
The lower you go on the list, the more room there is for debate. The more room there is to say, you don't have to agree with me on this to still be an Orthodox Christian.
Right.
And so this area of the dinosaurs, even the interpretation of Genesis, as long as you believe God created the universe, you can disagree on the how, the when, you can disagree on that. So when it comes to the dinosaurs, there's a few different schools of thought. You could see it through the lens of 6 literal 24-hour days. And of course, we know God is all-powerful. He could absolutely create the universe in 6 24-hour days. That is one possibility. If you can believe that, you are an Orthodox Christian.
Sure.
You could also see through the lens of, I believe it's 1 Peter, where it talks about to God every day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So God operates outside of time. So could it be that when it talks about days, there was evening, there was day, could it be that Peter is alluding to that it's 1,000 days, and that's more of a evolution? You can look at it that, could it be that the dinosaurs roamed the earth on what was, the 5th day, the 5th stage of world's creation, and they did not coexist with Adam and Eve at the same time? Possibly. You could believe that they were left off of the boat when Noah's Ark, came
I mean,
around.
they wouldn't fit, right?
Yeah, they wouldn't fit,
They're
exactly. And there is room to argue, there's room to debate on that, and no one should say, well, you're not a Christian, you don't believe in God if you disagree with me on this. Now, what would be interesting is to see how, this is one of those questions I want to ask Jesus when I get there, were the dinosaurs just placed there? Like their fossils were placed there when he created the world? Because it's interesting to think that Adam and Eve were not created as newborns. They were created as full-grown adults.
Right.
Was the world created that way? Not in a microcosm, like by just 2 cells,
Right.
but it was created fully formed with dinosaur fossils intact.
Right.
I don't know. It'll be really interesting to ask that question to Jesus. But throughout, especially the Old Testament, there are allusions to these fantastic creatures. The
Right.
Leviathan gets mentioned in Job. You have these great beasts that get talked about, and God is greater than them all. So there does seem to be some allusion in the Old Testament that, there are these tremendous creatures that have walked the world, are walking the world, that we don't understand. And again, there's room for debate on that.
Sure.
Now, do I know if Adam and Eve rode a T-Rex? I don't know. I can't answer that specifically.
That would be cool and terrifying. at the
And
same time.
terrifying. But again, the important thing to know is there's so much room for debate on this.
Sure.
And you can go to the ARC exhibit down in Kentucky.
Mhm.
You can learn a lot. And you can also go study, under, someone who has done all the examination of the fossil records and says, well, carbon dating says this. Do your own research in many ways. But neither
Right.
one would eliminate the fact that you are a better or worse Christian because you believe something.
Right.
Mhm.
How funny would it be, when we go to, I don't know if it'd be funny or not, but just astounding when you go to heaven and then you just in the distance see a T-Rex just kind of running around.
Yep,
Like,
yep.
Didn't expect that, but here we are.
That wasn't on my bingo card.
Right. So the next question I had was talking about the Bible.
Mhm.
So we know, the books, table of contents, all the books that are listed that we all know and love, but there's more, right? So they're banned books. What are they? Why didn't they make the cut? Are they scandalous? Are they just too lengthy?
Right.
Why?
Yeah, this one always comes up when it seems like the History Channel or the Discovery Channel comes out with a new, documentary of the banned books of the Bible,
Right.
or the conspiracy theory that comes off almost like clickbait on the internet, where it's like the Pope tried to hide the truth about Jesus
Right.
2,000 years ago. And yes, there are other books that are outside of the canonical Bible that claim to be scripture writings. And
Mhm.
here's kind of when we talk about the conspiracy and then kind of the factual side of it as I see it. So the conspiracy is that the early church, about the 3rd century, when they were deciding, what should go into the New Testament, basically ran PR for Jesus, saying well, this makes him look bad, so we can't put that book in. Or this is something that would just be too confusing. We'll keep this out. And so then these books get lost throughout time. They get discovered, and people are thinking, oh my gosh, it was some conspiracy theory. And I don't think that's what it was. To me, we have these books that did not get into the Bible in many ways because they were written later. That's one of the reasons. They did not exist when the Bible was being put together, specifically the New Testament. Due to, again, carbon dating, you can say, oh, the earliest manuscript we have of this gospel of fill in the blank only goes to the 3rd century, whereas the gospel writings all were from the 1st century, eyewitness accounts of Jesus. So they were the first to be floating around. So that's one, is some gospels were just simply written later. They didn't exist. What one scholar predicts that some of these gospels would do was someone would discover a hidden gospel that gave an alternative, with an agenda, teaching about Jesus, and then slap someone's name on it. Oh, this is the gospel according to Judas. Oh, Judas wrote this, and of course it makes him look like a good guy.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But
Right.
the person who discovered it became famous for discovering it. So, humans haven't changed that much. Now, that's one thing that's happening with some of these books. The other one is, we studied this as a church back in the fall, that when Paul went to Galatia, planted the early church, then he leaves to go plant other churches. These super apostles, these Judaizers, come into the church in Galatia, and they start spreading false teaching about Jesus. So why did Paul write the book of Galatians, as we said in the fall? To correct their thinking. Hey, that's not right. That's a heresy. Don't forget, you know what I mean? This is the true gospel. Trying to remind them of that. So that was part of what was going on when they came up with this council to decide what books should go in, was they were trying to actually correct people's thinking on theology, because there were some books floating out there. Gospel of Thomas comes to mind, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Judas are being circulated amongst the Gospel of Luke, amongst the Gospel of John, and people are like, these seem to be contradictory views of Jesus.
Sure.
Just as an example, one of the most famous is the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas's view of Jesus is considered heretical because it has a Gnostic background. And what Gnosticism was a early church heresy that the way you got into heaven was through secret knowledge, secret teaching, almost borderline as we think of the occult. That Jesus was able to give a secret knowledge to people, and if you had the secret knowledge, then you could get to heaven. It wasn't through faith, and it wasn't through what we would say is Orthodox Christianity. So this has started to float out there. And so the church fathers are like, okay, we need to come up with the official list of like, these are real, these are not, these are true, these are heresies.
Sure.
And so, yeah, when we examine the history of it, you begin to see, oh, okay, it was trying to preserve the truth and push out the lies so that we can know the true teachings of Jesus and what he actually calls us to do.
Sure. That makes sense. So we're not expecting to see like the Bible, the sequel, coming out at any time soon.
No.
Okay.
Like, of course, like when they find these things, theologians are quick to do their research, very quick. They want to know.
Sure.
People desire to know God, so they want to do the research. They don't want to just blindly reject it. But it's either through carbon dating that it's at a later date, or there's a hidden agenda, there's a heresy behind it. So they're like, okay, this is why it was discarded by the early church, to preserve the true teachings.
Okay. Well, speaking of, we talked about at one point, some of those books of the Bible may put Jesus in a different lighting, and stuff like that. We read to be slow to anger and self-control, but there is a story in the Bible where Jesus loses his cool. He flips a table. I mean, what are we to think of that, and how can we?
Not only does he flip a table, he makes a whip. Like,
I mean, what? Is that cool of him to lose his cool? I mean, I just don't understand.
The nice thing about Jesus doing that is he's God. So, everything he does is righteous, but that's still, that's only part of the answer. The answer that as we look at that specific moment is we look at Jesus, he seemingly on the surface walks into the temple and just becomes like this uncontrollable rage at the people, and he's like, someone get me a whip, and I'm just going to start, literally flipping out. I'm flipping tables. And that's not what happened. We read it, but we need to, actually examine what the text says, where it says he went and made a whip. You can't just make a whip in 5 seconds. So as I had one seminary professor describe it, he sat down and went one over, next over. He actually threaded it together. So he's thinking about what he's doing is one. So in that day, he is actively thinking, okay, this is what I need to do. The second thing we need to understand is Jesus had been going to the temple since he was 8 days old, when he was dedicated and circumcised on the 8th day. So he spent his entire life going to the temple at least once a year. We know that he spent extensive time when he was 12 years old, one of the only stories we have from his childhood, and he spends multiple days in the temple while his parents look for him. Well, the money changers and, their malpractice of selling, the perfect sacrifice and upcharging on the animals was not new. He'd have been seeing this his whole childhood. He knew what they were doing. He knew it was wrong. He also knew it was not his time yet. The Gospels constantly say it was not yet time. And then they say now it is time for him to go and basically get the attention of Rome, get the attention of the Jewish leaders. How are you going to get someone's attention? How are you going to get the attention of those in power? Disrupt the flow of money.
Sure.
So he does this as a public, basically protest that you all are desecrating my Father's house. But he does it in a controlled anger. One of the most important, if not the most important chapter of the Old Testament is a story in Exodus chapter 34 where Moses has this interaction with God. And he's on his 40 days up on Mount Sinai with God, and he says, I want to see your face. And God says, you cannot handle seeing my face, but I will pass by, and you will see, essentially the back of me, and that's the only way you'll be able to survive, because if you could not handle all my glory. And so it says, as God is passing by Moses on the rock, he almost covers him with his hand. And as God passes by, he is declaring these truths about him. Like, this is the Lord, the one true God, who is merciful, gracious, and slow to anger. What's fascinating in that text when he says slow to anger, it actually is a Hebrew idiom for long of nostrils, which we're like, I wouldn't think of that. It's like long of nostrils. But what they mean by that is, like, when there is something wrong, he's patient. Doesn't mean it's okay, but he is slow to anger in it. When we think short of nostrils, we think of like a raging bull.
Sure.
Like someone who's ready to just attack. that is not our God. Our God is patient, slow, and he is not slow in keeping his promises, as 1 Peter says, but he waits patiently so that all might come to repentance. So his truest nature is he's patient, he's incredibly slow to anger. So this story is of a righteous anger, saying, I need to get these people's attention, not only because it's my time to become the sacrifice, but also for them to realize this is not the purpose of the temple. The temple is not for you to make money. The temple is for God to be worshiped and glorified so that all people might come in. So, again, it wasn't a quick snap decision he flips out. It was planned. It was the perfect timing, and it was exactly when it needed to happen.
Yeah, I think that might be one of those things that gets kind of twisted where, we always talk about Jesus and God just being patient, being kind, being loving. And then, the opposite of that is anger. But it's saying being slow to anger, not being angry.
Yes. There is, righteous anger is an important distinction. Righteous anger, in my opinion, is every time you're driving your car, you're angry, it's probably not a righteous anger. A righteous anger is what angers God angers me.
Right.
It breaks my heart as it breaks God's heart. That our emotions are lined up with God in that way. That if we understood what the temple was for and the worship of God, and then someone tries to monetize that, how could that not make God angry?
Sure.
That's what should break our heart, is what breaks God's heart. So that's what Jesus was trying to do, is to demonstrate a righteous anger. Don't be afraid of the anger of God. He's not just going to gorge you like a bull, but align your heart with his, that you see it in the same way he does.
Right. And when you're talking about how he had been seeing this, pretty much from day one of his earthly life, no one's going to take seriously a 12-year-old flipping a table and making a whip. They're going to be like, this kid's having a tantrum.
Yeah.
So having that patience and just, this is not the time. I mean, that makes sense.
When you study Holy Week, the week leading up to Jesus' death and crucifixion and ultimately being the sacrifice of God, it is incredible. The more you study it, the more you see how everything lines up perfectly to get to that moment of the cross, and ultimately to Easter Day. It's like he was fulfilling this prophecy. He's fulfilling this. This is coming full circle from Genesis. So it's like God is trying to bring his kingdom on earth, and that looks like overturning some evil tables.
Sure.
But not just to say, and I'm going to destroy you in the process, is to say, so that I can get your attention,
Right.
and you can have a purified heart and worship me in spirit and truth.
Right. Some good stuff. Well, this one's kind of taken a little bit of a turn, but, we covered kind of a lot throughout the Bible, but this is towards the very end.
Yeah.
And we're talking about
This one comes up a lot.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's wondering about the apocalypse, the end of times, because it feels like that constantly. I mean, you think of Y2K, and I mean, they made a movie. What was it, 2012?
Yeah.
All of that. I mean, how?
Is that the one with the submarines and all that stuff? Yeah, the arcs. Yeah.
Terrible movie.
Yeah, Michael Bay probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Not sponsored. What are we supposed to? How do we process that, and what are we to think of the end of times?
Yeah. Yep. Again, this one tends to come up more regularly than when the History Channel releases like a banned books documentary. Right. But you see something on the news, you see someone's commentary saying, is this a mark of the end of the world? Is this something that was predicted in Revelation? Those things come up, and then it naturally instills a fear in us of oh my goodness, are we is it next Tuesday?
Right.
That this is coming? If this war doesn't go a certain way, does that mean the end of the world?
Sure.
And it just creates chaos. It creates a lot of confusion and honestly fear.
Right.
This is kind of the natural response. And if you were to look at the text of Scripture, there's two areas that there's multiple areas you could look at, but two areas that you should specifically look at would be Paul's very first letter ever written. So technically the first piece of Scripture written of the New Testament was 1 Thessalonians, where Paul is writing to the church he's writing to the Thessalonians. because the belief was right after Jesus ascended that he would be back soon. And they took soon to be like within our lifetime.
Literal.
Yeah. And I mean, I would too. If
Right.
Jesus said, it's going to come soon, you're like, in an hour, next
Right.
week? Like, what does soon mean? And so this church is watching that Jesus has not come back yet. And people within their church are dying. You know, they're either being persecuted or they're dying just of natural causes. And they naturally begin to panic. Like, oh, what does this mean? Like, Jesus hasn't come back yet. What about the dead? And Paul writes, and you can look at 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, he writes it to say, no, Jesus has conquered death. Again, the Bible does not say exactly where we are when we die. All we know for sure is we are at rest with Christ, that we are with him. We are in a good place. It is with Jesus, and we don't need to be in fear of our loved ones. We don't need to worry about contacting them. We don't need to worry about trying to bring them back. They are with Christ. They are whole. They are resting. And so Paul is trying to get the early church to understand is mourn, yes, mourn for those who have died, for those who have gone before you, but do not mourn as those who do not have hope. We have our hope set in a God who has conquered death, and those we love who have already passed on are with him. That's a reason to hope. We still mourn, but we have hope. He then goes on in the next few sentences to say, but I know you're basically still curious. So here's how we can understand it. Again, written to a first century audience. To say, when Christ returns, it will be with the trumpet blast, that famous imagery that we think of, a trumpet blast announcing his arrival. Now, to the first century, that would have made sense because if a king were to go out and to go and conquer a city, when he returns as the conquering king, the first thing that would happen when they saw him coming from a distance is they would go to the city walls and they would have a trumpet blast. And then those within the city who were excited for the king's return would go and join him outside the city limit and then basically be a part of his procession, his parade into the city. And we see that happening, you know, when he rides in on a donkey. It's like an illusion, or it's an illustration of the king is here. That's what we see on Palm Sunday. But he's saying, when I come back, it'll be, similar to that. And those who are joining Jesus in the procession outside of the city limits as he's coming from the skies, as Paul describes it, are the dead, are those who have gone before us who were in Christ. Those who are at rest, they will rise from their graves and they will join the procession. They will join the parade to be with Jesus as he enters into the city of earth that he has conquered. Now, that's one area to think about it. And Paul says, very clearly, that's a way we can understand that. Is Jesus coming back, and we should celebrate that as a conquering king. The second one that people should examine is Revelation. When you use the word apocalypse, people think of fireballs coming from the sky, right, and it's dark and it's chaos and people are crashing their cars and
floating up to the sky.
Floating up to the sky, and that's really a lot of that's rooted in a very recent theology. A lot of the Left Behind books have propagated this because it teaches a theology that we are going to abandon Earth in order to get to heaven. Let's leave this, car crash behind us and let's get out of here. And in fact, what Revelation and apocalyptic literature is teaching is, for one, apocalypse means to reveal the hidden. So all that has been hidden will be revealed. That's why it's called the revelation of Jesus. This is the story of Jesus. So when he comes back, it's not like this incredibly chaotic scene or anything like that. When he returns, the story of Revelation is trying to tell is that it's a few things, because it's very difficult literature.
Sure, right.
But what we can take it as is we are not called to just abandon Earth and just not care about those unbelievers and we just get out of here and we go to paradise. But in fact, the story the Bible is telling is that heaven and earth were created and there was complete overlap between them. God walked amongst Adam and Eve in the garden. And then when sin entered into the world, there's a split. And the only place there was overlap where people could go to be in the presence of God was in the tabernacle that we've talked about in Exodus, or the temple that was located in Jerusalem. But now that Christ has come, we are living temples, that the presence of God lives within us. So the goal in the Revelation, in the apocalypse, is not that the conquering King Jesus is leaving the city. He's bringing his kingdom to earth.
So he's bringing heaven to us.
Correct. And we get the time now as Christians to bring heaven to earth now. That all of eternity, it says, he has created a new heaven and a new earth, that we will live in a completely redeemed, set right, what is called the Garden City in Revelation, where everything that was on earth that was made by God, that was deemed as good in Genesis, will continue to exist. And all people will live together in harmony with Jesus, with God at the center. And it says there is no sun because we will see, but the glory of basically his being will emanate all throughout the world. And it is fascinating that there's no temple mentioned in Revelation once all things are made new and set right, because there's no need for a temple.
Sure.
We are together with God forever. The other thing that's important to note when someone mentions, well, I read it in Revelation, and there's a lot of things Revelation says that are very, it's intense. There's a lot of horses, there's the apocalypse, it comes off very scary when you read it. And you're like, this is a weird way to end the story of the Bible. Few things that's important to note that I always tell people when they want to read Revelation. One, it was written in the first century, not to Americans, but to a specific people group. And so it is language that is trying to get the persecuted early church to understand Jesus is coming back. Don't give in to the powers of Babylon. Don't give in to the powers of this world. Stay strong in Christ. It is written in a literature that if the letter would have been intercepted, those who had intercepted the letter would not be able to understand it, because there is a level of code that the early church would have understood. And it was teaching the gospel story. Just remember, Christ is coming back. He will make all things new. You don't need to be afraid, even if it costs you your life. Hold on. And unfortunately, what people do now is in that confusion, in that vagueness, they read into the story rather than reading out of the story. And they're like, well, it says this about this mark of the beast. And you're like, is it? Or is that just your 21st century American view that you're reading into it? So
it was meant to be reassuring.
Correct.
And kind of like that the bow at the end. It's like, this is what will happen.
Yes.
But people have twisted it and it became more fear-mongering of...
Can be. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't know about you. When I see... I'm a pastor. I've gone to seminary. And when I see a news clip about the end of the world, there's fear that instills in me, because it's like that's what's playing off of.
Right.
But I love the way that our son's Jesus Storybook Bible, the Bible that we give out for all kids who come to our churches, basically it wraps the entire story up and says, this is a great story. And it's a great story because it's a true story. And the last line of the Bible that Austin and Hannah read is, I love you and I'm coming back soon.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that it's it's not meant to be a code that you're supposed to decipher. Right. Tim Mackey with the Bible Project's done a lot of work on this. He's like, it's not a code that we can just crack if we had the exact right number of days, the weather aligns this way, the star patterns are over here. No, it says even the Father does, or even the Son does not know when the day will come. All we are meant to do is follow Jesus with all we have, bring his kingdom into our own little world, learn that we are going to be occupying planet Earth forever under a new kingdom where heaven has invaded Earth rather than us abandoning Earth behind.
So the new Earth is going to be our Earth 2.0.
Yes. Yes. A return to the garden.
Right.
But even better, because there is no serpent. There is no deceiver.
Right.
And so, again, C.S. Lewis. Had to be a C.S. Lewis one, guys. I always had to. in the last chapter of the Chronicles of Narnia series, he says, basically the new world starts to come in, and Aslan invites all of those who had followed him, all of the good Narnians, to say, come further up, come further in. And that's what they chant as they run into the new world. And it says, and with every step, they run faster and faster and faster, feeling more and more like children as they run after the great lion. And it says, this is whole world up till that very moment when heaven comes back to invade earth. It says all the world's history was the title page of the first chapter of the rest of the story. That all of this world is this big compared to all of eternity that's waiting for us once Jesus returns and makes all things new. We will have eternity to live in the kingdom with him.
It's crazy to think about when our concept of time and just my feeble mind can't fathom
right.
the entire history of the world is that's just not even a drop in the bucket.
Yep, absolutely.
That's
and it's
crazy.
the idea of we cannot chase finite pleasures when we have the infinite giver in front of us. So time with the infinite giver will never grow stale, will never grow old. We'll be with Jesus forever, enjoying all that he created as good, as it was always meant to be enjoyed. With people we were always meant to love and never have division amongst.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a much more compelling view, in my opinion, than what we often get offered in our culture.
Right.
But yeah,
Right.
it's a beautiful mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's why they call it faith.
That's right. That's right. He's coming soon.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was a great time. I had fun.
Absolutely.
It's nice to switch things up a bit and I don't know. We should do this again more.
Sounds good to me. Ask your questions, gang. Maybe we'll do this again.
Sounds great.
Have a good rest of your year.
See ya, church.